Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. Boy, memories are certainly short, aren't they? The older I get, I think the shorter my memory gets. I did remember to get up this morning. Forgot where I was going. In a way, when we read that Old Testament lesson, it appears that the Hebrews got up that morning as well and forgot where they were going. Forgot also where they had been. Forgot in reality what it was all about. You know, the story of the Hebrew people was that they sojourned into Egypt. And after a while they became captive of Egypt. They were abused, they were mistreated, and things just progressively got worse. But they forgot about that. God came, delivered them. That spectacular crossing of the sea, where the water piled up on each side, and they walked through the middle on dry ground, pursued by the bad guys. Got to the other side, and the bad guys got eliminated. And the people were free. And a couple of weeks later, they're complaining to Moses and Aaron, "Did you bring us over here so we could starve? Did you bring us over here so we could die?" Forgetting about everything that had happened the last 20, 30, 40 years. Memories are short. God's memory, on the other hand, is a bit longer. And God heard their complaining, and God gave to them meat in the evening and manna in the morning, enough to fill their bellies and to satisfy their needs. The people were once again saved. So here we are 3,000 years later. And our memory perhaps is short as well. For I think we forget all that God has done for God's people. We forget the salvation history of the Old Testament. And at times I think we even forget what it was that Christ was all about. Changing the way we see the world. Changing the way we understand the reality of God in the lives we live. Our memories are short. I think it becomes a challenge for us. If you look at the front of our bulletin this morning, you see the mission of our church here at Grace Parish. To know Christ and to make Christ known. What is it that you expect when you come here on a Sunday morning? What is it really that you expect? For some, it's a good show. For others, it's incredible words of wisdom that you usually get, not necessarily this morning. But you know, when you really think about it, most of us come here on a Sunday morning thinking of ourselves. What am I going to get out of this? What kind of entertainment am I going to see? What kind of words of wisdom are going to be imparted to me? What kind of good feelings am I going to have? What does that have to do with knowing Christ and making Christ known? What is it that we really come here on Sunday morning to receive? When we put our hand out and receive that piece of bread, that piece of the reality of Christ in our lives, that sacrament, what do we expect to happen? My suspicion is we expect something to happen to us. And the reality is that's not what Christ is about. Oh yes, we're going to be fed. We're going to be strengthened. We are saved. No question. But what is the purpose of that salvation? What is it that we really receive in that reality of Christ in our hand in the Eucharist? What is it really all about? It's about reaching out and being something greater than we are. It's not just being fed. It's being fed for a purpose. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is that purpose? How do we know Christ? And how do we make Christ known? The story of this morning's gospel lesson is the story of the reality of God in our lives. It's also the story of us. You know, that story started with the vineyard owner going down to the labor hall on the morning at 6 o'clock and hiring enough laborers to go out and pick his grapes. And then at 9 o'clock, he kind of happened by the labor hall again and invited more people to go into the vineyard. The first people had been promised a fair day's wage. They bought into it. They agreed. The second people were told they would be paid appropriately. And he did the same thing at noon, and the same thing at 3, and then 5 o'clock, an hour before the closing of the vineyard, he goes out once again and brings more people in to pick his grapes. And then payday comes. And the last people got paid a fair day's wage. And then the next group of people got paid a fair day's wage. And then it went down to the people who showed up at 6 o'clock and they got paid a fair day's wage that they had agreed to. And what did they do? Short memory. They complained. We sat out in the sun all day. We got a sunburn on our head. We're sweating. Our clothes are wiped out. And you paid them the same thing you're paying us? That's not fair. And the vineyard owner says, but that's what you agreed. There were 10 years between our firstborn child and our secondborn child. My daughter was born in 73 and my son in 83. And I remember the day my son came home from the hospital, my 10-year-old daughter came up to me and said, Daddy, am I still going to be your princess? She kind of felt that there was a limited pot and that she had had her portion and now her brother was going to get his portion. And she wasn't going to get it anymore. Is that the way we deal with God? Those of us perhaps who were at the 6 o'clock or maybe the 9 o'clock vineyard gathering, do we expect God's love to kind of get proportioned to the amount of work that we do? The reality of God is that love of Christ is given to each of us fully, completely, and irrespective of whether we deserve it or not. And if you really are honest with yourself, we probably don't deserve it all that much. That love of God is given to us fully and completely. Some of you know I have a very large dog. Well, large if you consider 140 pounds to be big. And Toby is persistent. And one of the things that he dearly loves is fresh-made bread. And Jackie, my wife, had made a zucchini loaf. And I was sitting in my big chair watching the football game and enjoying the zucchini bread. And Toby came over and put his head in my lap. Expect. I want a piece of that bread. And I told him to go away. And he went 3 feet back and sat down and looked at me with those big brown eyes. And I didn't give him any. I was thinking of myself. And after I finished the bread, he came over and put his head in my lap and looked up at me with those same brown eyes and licked my hand. He was telling me that although he loved the bread, that wasn't really what it was all about. How do we deal with this reality of God? How do we deal with knowing Christ and making Christ known? Do we deal with it the way Toby did? Asking for the bread? Backing off patiently? And then remembering that it wasn't the bread that it was all about, it was being cared for and loved. Our calling as Christians, our calling as members of this place, is not to come to church on Sunday morning expecting God to do something for us. It's expecting God to be present in our lives. Not to feed us, but to reach out into the world around us and allow the reality of God's presence to be known. Not through the things that we do, but through the people that we are. Our challenge, the challenge of all of us as Christians, is to remember the reality of Christ's sacrifice on the cross and remember what it was about. It was to show us that we are something greater than ourselves, that we're called to reach out into the world around us with Christ's love and grace. It's not about feeding us. It's about being part of God's whole creation and enabling that reality of Christ to touch lives. We are called to receive that sacrament of Christ's body and blood, to be strengthened. Yes, to deal with the world around us, but more importantly, to reach out into that world and allow Christ to be present. It isn't about spending an hour in a building. It isn't about the show. It isn't about even the words spoken in the sermons. It's about feeling the reality of God in today's life and being a part of that reality. Whether we come at 6 in the morning, or at 9, or at noon, or at 3, or at 5. We're called to be Christ's people. Yes, look for and know Christ's presence. But more importantly, take that presence out into the world and allow Christ to be known through us. May God feed us. May God strengthen us. May God enable us to truly be His people. In Christ's holy name. Amen.